Hmm. Have you ever looked into a pond or your local tide pool and seen teeny tiny squiggly looking things and wondered, what are those? Well, today we are going to explore the macroinvertebrates that live out in the Elkhorn Slough. My name is Ariel Hunter. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator here on the education team at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, and I absolutely love macroinvertebrates. So I'm going to take you out to the salt marsh to look at some of these animals up close, and then we will be going back in here to the microscope lab to look at them even closer through the microscopic lens. But first, what is an invertebrate? Invertebrates are animals that do not have backbones or vertebrae. Some are found in the ocean, like the clams and shrimp buried beneath the mud here, noticeable only by their breathing holes. But there are many invertebrates on the land, like snails, spiders, and all insects. Now that we've had a chance to look at some of our larger invertebrates, let's take a closer look at our microscopic ones, what we call macroinvertebrates, because they are the same, they're invertebrates, just like the ones we've been looking at, and they're big enough to see with the naked eye. They're macro, but they're tiny, and so you need a microscope to really see them up close. So here is our sample of macroinvertebrates that I pulled from the dock that you just saw. Let's get these critters under a microscope. So first we have a whole bunch of GAMMARID amphipods. Amphipods look like teeny tiny shrimp with a curled under abdomen. And in a second, we'll look at the face of this amphipod. And as we zoom in, you can see that its eye looks different from ours. It looks like a golf ball. Each of those little dots isn't a different pair of eyes, but rather kind of like a different pixel in an image. So they see the same way that the Super Mario games of yesteryear looked like. And you can also see on these amphipods that they have two sets of antennas to smell with and several legs that run down their whole of their body. Notice the prominent tentacles on this animal. This is an anemone. All of those tentacles have little stinging cells in them that help this anemone to catch its prey even though it's stuck onto the platform that it's attached to. So it can't run around and move to catch its prey. Instead, it waves its tentacles around, waits for something tiny to attach to them, and then it stings that prey, pulls it into its mouth, which you can see in the center there. And it is possible for this anemone to clone itself if it rips a piece of the base off. So you can actually find two anemones here tomorrow. Remember that stuff from the beginning that just looked like seaweed that I put in the dish? Well, it was actually an animal. In fact, it's kind of hundreds of animals, hundreds of macroinvertebrates, but all clones. This is called a bryozoan, and coming off of those little branches are these little boxes you can see, and each box contains a different clone of the same bryozoan. And each clone has a little water balloon body and a tentacle called a lophophore that it feeds with. And this looks like an inactive colony, which is great substrate for other animals like this amphipod to crawl around on. Let's look at an active colony. Can you see the lophophores or the tentacles that look like flower cups coming out of each of those little boxes? Each of the lophophores is connected to a body. Each body is connected via stomach to everybody else. So when one of those creatures feed, it feeds the entire colony, which is really good if you live in an area with not a lot of food source, or if you're attached, like these are, and can't go running around. Here's another species of bryozoan. This one, instead of growing in branches, it spreads out almost like a crust, but you can still see that lophophore, the tentacles, coming out from the live individuals. And what's cool about bryozoans as a colony is they can actually grow defender ones at the edges of the colony that have spikes to protect the ones on the inside. So if a predator comes up, it only eats some of the bryozoan clones, not all of them. Check it out. We also have a polychaete worm in this sample. These are worms that have bristles all over their body. You can just see them outlined on the top of its head there that's wiggling around. And often they like to live in tubes that can be made of all sorts of different things. Or sometimes they'll just bury themselves under the mud itself. In fact, in a bucket of mud, you can usually find about 500 of these. This is probably my favorite invertebrate, the sponge. Sponges are animals. They consume to survive, meaning they have to actually eat microscopic organisms. But if you look up close at the tissue that this sponge is made of, you can see all the little holes. This is actually made of a tissue different from every other animal on the planet. Most every other animal, your organs or your body is made up of endoderm. Their tissue, mesoderm, can actually restitch itself together. So if this sponge has a small animal, like that amphipod you saw, bore a hole into it, it can just restitch itself around that hole, and now the sponge can survive and the amphipod has a home. So a sponge is an animal that's also a habitat. And lastly, there are animals that make their home out of the muck and slime around them. And that's this animal called a TANAID. Tanaids look a lot like amphipods. You can see they have the two sets of antennas and those same golf ball pixelated eyeballs. But they have a slightly longer tail that doesn't curve under, and instead of swimming around, they actually try to plant themselves down in the mud, and they create a nice sticky tube full of mucus and dead stuff to live in. And you can see this one feeding with its little claws. It's grabbing what looks like a leftover molt or exoskeleton from another animal and seeing if it can feed off of that. But they'll also capture teeny tiny plankton with their antennae and scoop it into their mouth. So another really cool thing about macroinvertebrates is they can actually tell you about the health of a system. So what that means is that some of these creatures will not live in an area if the saltiness is too high, or if the temperature is wrong, or if there's a really high pH or really low pH, it's very acidic. And so if we look at the number and kinds of these macroinvertebrates out in our saltwater system or habitat out here, we can actually begin to understand whether that water is healthy or not. One animal that I didn't get a good video of, but did get this great photo of, was the skeleton shrimp, also called coprelids. And coprelids are a good sign for water quality because they're more sensitive to harmful things in the water than some of the other creatures that we've seen. So seeing them is a good sign. Based off today's sample, I would say that our water is pretty healthy. We had a great diversity of creatures in there. We had different kinds from that coprelid and those amphipods, which have those exoskeletons like crabs, to things like the sponges and the bryozoans, which are entirely different. And that diversity tells me that the water is probably doing pretty well. Welcome to the salt marshes of the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. These habitats get most of their water from the ocean through the tides. Every day, the tides rise and fall twice. Water fills in between the salt marsh plants at high tide. As the tide falls, it reveals a wide expanse of mud and a few scattered rocks. Today, as we take a few quiet moments to observe these habitats as the tide rises, focus on these key questions. What do you notice about this habitat? What kinds of organisms might live here? What challenges may they encounter? What do you wonder about what you're seeing? That's all from us. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.